Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the Revolution de la Franca. Yes, yes, we've gone through a little bit of the 7 Years' War, and the American Revolution happens, and then you may have seen in your textbook, if you got there, that some former slaves on the island of Haiti are going to rebel as well. And then there's some people in France, mostly middle class, similar to middle class and upper middle class, similar to what happened in America, and supported even more in France by the poorer classes eventually, more so than in America. And when we look at this here, I want to remind you where stuff is. When we look at the map, I've got my little, mouse pointer. It should turn into a laser pointer, though. There we go. Something cool with PowerPoint. And you've got France right here, which is, if you look at the size of France, in comparison with other standalone countries, Austria and Hungary are sort of this area that's sort of split together, but they're not entirely united, okay? And Poland, Lithuania, again, two different peoples put together, not entirely united. Prussia, a growing state. The Holy Roman Empire, not yet Germany. And then these guys, and France is freaking huge, okay? It's just a massive country, really rivaled only in Western Europe by possibly Spain. So France, when we talk about a revolution, we're talking about 20, 30 million people getting involved eventually in something like this. And the revolution in France is going to be is going to be something fearsome to all the rest of Europe, because if France actually changes its nature for the first time in history in Europe, a country rebelling against a monarchy and creating something else, then all these guys have some stake in it, because France is involved in everything. So everybody here has some stake in it, and they're going to have to decide how to handle it. I should also say Britain, too, is going to be, they're right there. So it depends on what the French Revolution actually does and whether or not it looks like it will be a threat to the rest of Europe. And it will absolutely, 100%, spoiler alert, be a threat to the rest of Europe. Okay, let's move in. So a lot of things are going to be happening here. You've heard of the guillotine. Americans heard of the guillotine first. Sorry, I had some fun animation there. Americans heard of the guillotine first when a American news correspondent was in Paris and actually reported about this new device that actually sped up the process of humanely cutting off the head of somebody who is to be executed. And this guillotine is going to become the symbol of the French Revolution. I'm just going to say this. If your symbol of revolution and rebirth as a nation is a weapon of execution, if that's your symbol, if that's what everybody thinks of when they think of a quote-unquote revolution, then, well, it may not be long-lived. It may not have long legs, because that is not usually the thing that unites people. This is a weapon of fear and vengeance and reprisal. It is not a symbol of flowery love and happiness and growth. This is not the way to go. This is not a U.S. Declaration of Independence and Mel Gibson running around after Colonel Tavington. I am here, for the freedom of America and all that stuff. That is not what this is. This is a you speak up against us and you die by this real just interesting machine. Okay, so always in front of people, by the way, always in front of hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, who will be watching this process. So is this what you want to be your symbol? And I will tell you that since this guillotine does become the symbol of the French Revolution, the French Revolution in some ways is doomed to failure just because of that one thing. And so let's get into it. I have all kinds of crazy stats about guillotines, but I'm probably not going to get into it right here. All right. So let's talk about how this thing happened and who the people were and the whole deal. All right. So French society is divided. There's three estates, the way the French looked at it. Okay. The three estates. The first estate, 1% of the population. That's right here. The second estate is 2% of the population right here. So 3 total percent. And then the rest is 97%. Okay. So if it was, if Bernie Sanders was around right now, he'd be talking about the 3%. All right. And so this is everybody else, and everybody else includes everything from the upper middle class all the way down, and including the bourgeoisie, the merchant elite, all the way down to the poorest peasant. Okay. So this is everybody else. When you have a society where most of the wealth is concentrated up here, that's always a bad sign, because eventually These people might decide that they want some of that wealth that is being accumulated here, and you have some kind of revolution or at least lots of protests and anger. So, who are these guys? Who's the first estate? Who's the second estate? Who's the 97% of the third estate? Well, the first estate is the Roman Catholic clergy. That's the church, which by the time we get to the 1780s and 90s, when the French Revolution happens, although the Roman Catholic Church is still in charge of France and of Italy and of parts of the Holy Roman Empire, but not all of it anymore, and also of Spain, although that's true, the people of France, their grip on being controlled, I should say, by the Catholic Church is less than it's ever been, because the Catholic Church has been losing its authority over time, especially because it has all the most wealth. 1% of the population in France, French and foreign church officials, have most of the wealth of the country of France. And that's just, if you start to starve, if your kids are starving because of famine and whatnot, we'll talk about that in a minute. If you're having trouble surviving, if taxes are high, and you look over at a church official who's supposed to be a man of God or a woman of God, and they're just living it up, going to balls and stuff that the second estate is throwing, which is the nobility, right? The guys that own all the land, all the land is owned by these guys and these guys, and they're just, boy, are they living it up when we get to the middle of or the late 1700s. The clothes that they wear, the balls that they throw, I think the one way to look at this, imagine the opulence that you see in Beauty and the Beast, the movie or the cartoon, it doesn't matter. Beauty and the Beast, the opulence of the first part of the story, where you see that noble who's dancing with everybody before the curse happens, the opulence of that mansion around it, the wealth that's in there, all those books, the library that Belle is so enamored with, all that stuff is just the sign of just sheer and utter wealth. And this is a period of time when people were going to parties thrown by nobles, dressed in and things that they would only use one time, but dresses that would cost up to $20,000 to $30,000, and wigs that they'd put on their hair, especially the women, with bird cages in them with live birds, who would probably be dead by the end of the party, but they didn't care. All the food and the whole thing. And the common classes, the 97% of the rest of France, didn't have access to any of that stuff, but it was their money. It was their labor that created that money that those wealthy people are using, not quietly behind the scenes, but blatantly in front of everybody, like nobody's ever going to care. So that's where we are. This is the time where things are going to get rough, and people will put up with a lot. The bourgeoisie, who had money from the market, and the peasants who didn't have much money from the market, but they make the market happen, right? It's amazing what a people will put up with, how much they will suffer under overbearing rule by evil people, I would say, just awful people at the very top who don't see the other people, the other 97% of their country, just don't see them. They use them, but they don't see them, It's amazing how much people will put up with until they are starving. And once you're starving, well, early death is assured. Your kids can't eat food. You're desperate. You're hungry. Once you get to that point, usually rebellions happen no matter what, because, well, there's nothing else to lose. You're going to die anyway, of a horrible long death of malnutrition. So eventually, why not die trying to change your country? Why not do that? So people can be driven to absolute insanity if they are pushed far enough. And the first two estates of France just pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed until there was nothing else for the third estate to do. It's just that the third estate doesn't do it that well because they're not being led by leaders, because all the leaders are going to be killed, because all the leaders are at the very top, all right? So economic problems. France has been involved in a ton of wars and wasteful spending. The wars go all the way back. We're talking about wars from before the American War of Independence, i.e. the 7 Years' War, for instance, many wars that happened before then between France and England. And then, of course, the American War of Independence actually drives France into bankruptcy almost. The French were not ready. They were not able. Remember, the 7 Years' War that happened before the American War of Independence was when France lost most of its colonial territory to the English. So the income of France was much less, It wasn't like a poor country as long as you spent right, but the income of France was much less after the 1760s than it was before. But the nobility and the church keep on spending as if they were still, they were running up a deficit, like a country I know of that I live in, just running up a deficit without any real concern for how to pay it off. Eventually it gets to be too much. And if you suddenly have a deficit like that, and then you go into yet another war that you're not going to get much out of, that's going to break your bank. And France, because they really wanted to punish Britain for taking all their colonies and winning that 7 Years' War, France is going to go help the Americans kick the British out of North America, or at least their 13 colonies that were so profitable during the American Revolution. But the French don't really get much back from that. And as a result, the French economy gets even worse during the 1770s. So it's only about 10 years later that you get into the French Revolution. What happens during that 10 years? Well, it's really this. In the 1780s, bad food harvests. What are the bad food harvests from? Well, to be honest with you, it's kind of a wonky geological thing. One of the reasons that there was bad food harvests was because there was a volcano that erupted in Iceland, and that volcano was so just prolific with its ash and dust that the actual weather patterns of parts of Central Europe changed for a while. Those weather patterns caused droughts in parts of Europe, including France. Here's, of course, Versailles, where so much of that wealth was accumulated that we talked about a couple of lectures ago. Paris has palaces as well. All the nobles that take their money from their people that live on their land are building palaces that look a bit like Versailles and living like it, right? It's just, the opulence is insane. Let's talk about what's going on here. King Louis XVI is going to call this thing called the Estates General, which many kings just ignored. The Estates General is one of these meetings that involves the nobility, involves members of the church, and involves some of the upper middle classes usually, okay, which is some of the bourgeoisie who have a lot of money, interests in French businesses, okay? So that's the Estates General. And the king is like right up there. And the idea of this is to bring the country together because in the 1780s, here it is, 1789, this is just before the French Revolution starts. And 1789, the king finally realizes that there might actually be some real trouble. And the common people, the 97% of the Third Estate, are really starting to get uppity and they're getting angry. And so the result of this is that the king calls together this council. And the goal of this, though, is actually to raise taxes to pay off French debt. This is the main reason that King Louis calls this, except that there's two major issues to be discussed. One, we need to raise money, mostly on the common people, to pay off our debts from the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence and all this stuff. And we also need to figure out how to stop any riots or rebellions that we think are coming. That's what this is about. So it's kind of an amazing rock and a hard place deal where you have a king saying, hey guys, let's go ahead and meet about the one thing that's going to cause more riots to happen. And let's also try to figure out how to stop the riots from happening. It's impossible. It's just, you can't raise taxes on people that are already overtaxed and can't feed themselves. You're not going to do it. Now, if you were smart, maybe you would set up some kind of program where you start bringing food in from other countries of Europe and you'd feed your people. And you always have to feed your people. You always have to feed them or they're just going to overthrow you. There is no other answer to that. And the French nobility just didn't quite understand to the extent to which the people of France, the common people, were really suffering. They just never got it. When that happens, it's probably time in Enlightenment terms to remove them anyway from power because they're not actually doing their job anymore. So what happens is that the Third Estate, the 97%, led by the bourgeoisie, the wealthy middle class people, are going to actually show up to this thing. And they form this thing called the National Assembly and say, we need to be heard. And the king doesn't let them in. Okay, the king does not let the bourgeoisie in to explain why the people are so angry and they're so hungry and they're suffering, just doesn't want to pay attention to them. I.e., the king was a moron. So the National Assembly stays outside, and they actually vow to create a fair constitution. And this is all happening outside in a tennis court, not happening in here. So what these guys are doing in the National Assembly is more like a club action than it is a actual function of government because they are not the government. But things are going to continue.
Versailles in the late 1700s is an oasis of extravagance, surrounded by a land in despair. And with an uncertain king at the helm, France is charting a course for disaster. After 19 years of marriage, Louis has sired 4 children. Yet as a king, he remains impotent. In an attempt to demonstrate leadership, Louis dabbles in financial reforms. But his misguided interfering burdens the poor with heavy taxes, while the nobility pay hardly at all. With the economy in shambles, the banks force Louis to hire a finance minister, Jacques Necker. An enlightened thinker, Necker is popular with the people in a way that Louis can only envy. Necker urges Louis to call a meeting of the traditional representative body of the kingdom, the Estates General. It is the first time the representatives have been called together in 175 years.
France was politically organized in something called the estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else.
May 4th, 1789. A skilled young lawyer and politician arrives at Versailles. Maximilien Robespierre comes to stand before the Estates General as a deputy to fight for a fair voice for the people he represents, the Third Estate. At the Estates General, Robespierre and his colleagues are demanding that the nobility and clergy pay taxes, but Louis feels increasingly threatened by the growing radicalism of the Third Estate. Then, on June 20th, after a 6-week deadlock, the deputies arrive to find that they are being silenced. The deputies declare themselves a new National Assembly, the true representatives of the people of France. In one revolutionary stand of defiance, the National Assembly is born. To defend themselves, the people form a new National Guard. Rioters raid Paris's armories and make away with over 28,000 muskets. The only thing missing is gunpowder, and the people know just where to get it. In the center of Paris, there looms a massive stone dungeon, notorious as a symbol of feudal rule, the Bastille. The prison houses the city's stores of gunpowder and is legendary as a den of torture and unspeakable deaths. On July 14th, crowds band together identifying themselves with a small cockade, red and blue for the colors of Paris, separated by white, the color of the House of Bourbon. The tricolore is born. From the feverish crowd, a voice cries out, "To the Bastille." With the smoke still clearing, Louis XVI returns from a hunting trip. An aide interrupts and breaks the news of the riots and the fall of the Bastille. Louis XVI asks, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," he replies. "It is a revolution."
Hopefully that came across okay. All right. So there you go. So what are some of the causes of the French Revolution? Let's get into it. So we have the National Assembly, where the people out there in the tennis courts are going to revolt and get gunpowder and weaponry out of the Bastille. All male citizens are part of the National Assembly in theory, so this National Assembly goes from a couple thousand people to tens of thousands of people in theory, where all male citizens who want to rebel can join this new government called the National Assembly. The National Assembly is going to declare something called the rights of man and the citizen. And what it says here is equality of all citizens and freedom of speech, press, and religion. They're basically taking this out of French and English Enlightenment thinkers, and the French revolutionaries, of course, have seen how Americans have put this stuff together in their own documents, and therefore, who have declared independence about 20 years before. So the French are kind of putting their own bent on that together. and they're creating a new government called the National Assembly. Now, the nobility is not being attacked directly yet, and the king is still there. It's just that the National Assembly is forcing itself by just, anger and sheer violence onto the stage, and they're saying, you guys have to listen to us, and we're going to be part of your government now. Deal with it. And so what they're doing is the National Assembly is actually forcing France to become a constitutional monarchy like England is. Keeps the king, but the king has limited powers. How is this going to go? What's going to happen? Let's find out. We have the National Convention and the National Assembly. We have a democratic republic similar to what England has. King Louis is going to try to flee with his wife. They're going to dress as peasants and try to run away. They're going to be caught. And as a result of this, because it was thought that King Louis was running away to go raise an army in Austria where his wife is from, Marie Antoinette, to come back and replace him or place him back onto the throne. And that's exactly what he was going to do. He was going to flee to Austria with supporters and then raise an Austrian/French loyalist army and then come back to put himself back on the throne. And so he was caught before he got out of France, and therefore he is going to be executed as a traitor to the new French Republic. Okay, that's what happens. So he's beheaded, as is his wife, Marie Antoinette.
Dr. Guillotin's chilling new device hangs over Paris like a warning. The penalty for defying revolutionary law and order. Freshly christened with the blood of the king's guards, it will soon put an end to the king himself. By August 1792, with the king deposed and the royal families secluded in the Temple prison, Robespierre and his Jacobins are locked in a battle with the moderates of the Assembly, the Girondins, for control of the national government. Robespierre had once pushed for a constitutional monarchy. Now he believes there is no longer room for the king. A momentous decision is made. France will put its own king on trial. With the verdict a foregone conclusion, the only debate left is punishment. The moderates, the Girondins, called for sparing Louis's life, which isolates them in the convention. But the Girondins are outnumbered by the Jacobin call for blood.
Why did the Jacobins want to kill the king? I think they wanted to kill the king because, as Robespierre brilliantly said, you have to kill the king so the revolution can live. If the king is right, then the revolution is wrong. In any system there had ever been, there's only one penalty for treason, and that is death. So in this sense, if the king is guilty of betraying the country in a time of war, then the argument is that he must suffer the death of a traitor.
On January 20th, 1793, Louis XVI is declared guilty. The sentence is read. The king must die. That evening, Louis is briefly reunited with his family. Calm in the face of their tears, he promises to return the next morning to say a final goodbye. He will not. He cannot bear his family's anguish and must not weaken on the way to the guillotine. The next morning, a closed carriage brings Louis to the scaffold. And he stoically makes his way to the blade. He attempts to give a speech.
I trust that my death will be for the happiness of my people, but I grieve for France, and I fear that she may suffer the anger of the Lord.
But the guards drown him out with a drum roll. 11:22 a.m., the man who once was king is no more. In the temple prison, Marie hears the cannons fire, heralding the death of her husband. She collapses in despair.
So that gives you an idea of what that's going to be like there. The killing of a king is a big deal. I mean, a huge step in the process of any country. And so that was obviously a big thing. Hopefully that's that image of Robespierre is creeping you out a little bit, because this guy was something else. He started as a young lawyer with a lot of prospects and turns himself into a dictator as probably as bad as the king was. So we need to look at this, because you've heard this name a few times now in the videos. Maximilien de Robespierre, right? Robespierre. And so he is the leader of the French Revolution, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to rule France through his National Assembly, his constitutional government. And unfortunately, it's not going to go as well as he would like. And so let's move into it. The Reign of Terror happens under Robespierre, which is one of the reasons why the United States does not get involved with helping the French Revolution out against their overlords, against the nobility, because the reports of the horrors of massacres of nobles in France and anybody that says anything in support of the nobility, anything like that, it's kind of like a big giant witch hunt of death, that the revolutionary armies are running around for the National Assembly and they're wiping people out. Now, this radical time, the Reign of Terror, is being run by a group being called, as you may have heard in the video, the Jacobins. It's kind of spelled Jacobians, but it's just said Jacobins. And the Jacobins are, under Robespierre, kind of the radical leader faction of the revolutionary forces, and they are basically going after anybody that might put down the rebellion or might help put down the rebellion, and they are murdering them with the guillotine. And so there are mobile guillotine forces that are accompanied by French revolutionary armies that are running around from town to town to town throughout France and finding people who might support the king, the nobility, anything like that, and executing them and then taking their property. All right, so that's what's going on.
Danton and Robespierre realize that they must boldly strike out to save the revolution. They convince their colleagues to institute a menacing new form of martial law. Thus begins a new chapter in the revolution, a period of violent repression called the Terror. In a remarkable reversal, the revolutionaries suspend the new constitution and all the rights it was to guarantee. The slightest suspicion can send anyone to the scaffold. Politicians who say a kind word of the defunct monarchy. Anyone who uses the formal monsieur or madame instead of the new form of address, citizen. The air is fraught with paranoia. Neighbors denounce neighbors. The incessant rolling of the death carts rattles through the streets of Paris. With the blood of the Terror, Maximilien Robespierre has rescued the revolution. An invigorated army is repelling attacks at the border, and internal dissent has been all but quashed. At the height of his success, Robespierre dreams up a loftier goal yet: to use more terror to mold a new kind of society, a republic of virtue.
By virtue, he means civic virtue. It's an active principle for Robespierre. For example, you cannot be a virtuous citizen by simply obeying the laws and keeping your head down. You must actively be involved in the work of the state, and that includes for Robespierre destroying the enemies of the state.
The Great Terror is the name given to the last phase of the Terror in the spring of 1794 into the summer of 1794. It's the period at which the tempo of executions really starts to increase, at which the atmosphere of paranoia, particularly in Paris, but really across the country, starts to increase exponentially.
There are those who think that Robespierre really has reached so extreme and so unreasonable a position that he can't turn back, that his fanaticism has somehow overtaken him, and there are those who think he's just gone nuts. turns out that there is a great deal of enthusiasm for ending the terror. Nobody can figure out how to do it. And what turns out to be the case is that the only thing that will end the terror, and apparently the only thing they can all agree upon, is the fall of Robespierre.
On July 27, 1794, the guillotine comes down on the incorruptible. And the last blood of the terror is shed.
All right. So there we go. The next government, once Robespierre is killed by people that are realizing that his reign of terror is not really going to be what creates a good country, is going to be called the Directory. So the Directory is going to be a government that follows Robespierre. Robespierre's Jacobin reign of terror. And these are not going to be people that are really good at government. And that's part of the problem, is that these are basically businessmen who have never run a government. They're not part of the nobility. The French government is, the old government is largely executed or fled. So these are people that really haven't learned how to run a country yet, and they're trying to run a huge country. It's not going to go well for them. So they're weak and corrupt and having trouble. So that's at 1795, and things are rough for people, going kind of poorly, and the new French system of a constitutional government, of which they've already suspended their constitution once, well, it's not really solving the problems of the people the way the people had hoped. Okay, so something else is going to happen while France is in the middle of what is really a civil war of people fighting for or against a revolution. And what's going to happen is a number of different countries in Europe who have family that are part of the nobility of France, or were, and people in other countries that are nervous because these countries, well, they're all run. All these countries around France are all run by monarchies or some kind of monarchy, except for Britain, which has their constitutional system. They're pretty safe. But the rest of these guys have old monarchies. And the problem with that is that the monarchs of these nations, who lead much like the French have led before, are concerned that the spirit of the revolution will spread, and therefore people will rise up and revolt against the monarchies of these other nations. And so it behooves these nations. It is important that the kings of, say, Austria and Prussia and Spain, for instance, put together some kind of coalition military system to maybe put down the French Revolution, to either stop it or even reverse it and put some other French noble that escaped France during the terror back on the throne and replace the French monarchy with a new one. So that's kind of where the people outside are. Meanwhile, France is asking the U.S. for help, you know, their old ally in the War of Independence, and America's just saying, nope, we're staying out of it, and that's its own story. So the kings of Britain, Spain, Austria, and Prussia are terrified of the revolutionary France, because it's clear that the people of the new government of France, you know, the new weak and corrupt government, are so, you know, they may not be ruling well, but they have a lot of spirit, and they want to take that spirit and spread it throughout Europe. So it's obvious that France may not just be existing in itself. It may start to try to overtake other nations with its will to overthrow kings. And so basically these countries decide to form an alliance to try to put down the French Revolution, which means there's going to be a whole bunch of people invading France from the outside to try to stop the revolution. So France is not only in a civil war, it's going to be at war with the rest of Europe at the same time. Okay, so that's where Napoleon comes in. Napoleon is going to be created as one of the generals of the new French military, and he's got to defeat all these foreign invaders. His job is not to worry about the civil war in France. His job is to worry about the other countries that are trying to put down the rebellion. So he has to take a good, solid French army and go up against the Austrians and the Spanish and the British and others. And we all know about Napoleon, probably, you know, these images of Napoleon when it comes to how effective he is at this. That's going to be the next lecture. There's 2 lectures this week, just the basics of the revolution, and then we are going to move into Napoleon, and I have a short lecture about him as well. Okay, thanks a lot.